What's up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Hockey on the Spot with Brandon Barenfeld. I'm Brandon Barenfeld. Thank you for joining me. This is episode 21 of Hockey on the Spot, continuing with the 30 teams in 30 days. And for today, we are going to talk about the Montreal Canadiens, or Montreal Canadiens with a French accent. Anyway, the Montreal Canadiens, after a terrible 2011-2012 season that saw them finish dead last in the Eastern Conference and 28th overall in the NHL. Huge bounce back year last year, finishing fourth in the National Hockey League standings, second in the East. They won the Northeast Division, and they finished the season with 63 points, 1 point more than the fifth place Boston Bruins, with a record of 29, 14, and 5 in a shortened season. So a very good year for them that saw them very consistent pretty much the whole year up until the final stretch. In their final 10 games, they went 4-6-0. They went 3-5-0 in their final 8, and that those struggles continued through the playoffs. A very disappointing early playoff exit. They were upset in 5 games by the Ottawa Senators, a division rival. So a tough way to go out after a great season that saw you rise to the rankings. But a lot of their regular season success this last year had to do with PK Subban, who won his first ever Norris Trophy for NHL's top defenseman. Brendan Gallagher, who was a runner-up for the Calder Trophy for Rookie of the Year. Jonathan Huberdeau of the Florida Panthers would win the honor. And then, of course, another guy, their third overall pick from 2012, Alex Galchenyuk. He was remarkable in his first season. He has a promising future. And they had a lot of contributions last year. Lars Eller, Max Pacioretty, he was the leading scorer for the Habs this season. He continues to get better and look like a superstar. Thomas Plekanec, Brian Giunta, Rennie Bork, those guys were good. The one guy, though, who they expected to be good but wasn't, unfortunately, was David Desharnais. He unfortunately had a setback year after a career year in 11-12. He'll look to have a bounce back year. But other than that, even though the Habs didn't have anybody in the top 30 in scoring, those guys were all remarkable. They were one of the top scoring teams in the league. And Carey Price had a very good season last year up until that final stretch. So, um, so basically, that's how it all stands for the Montreal Canadiens. But a little change was made that'll hopefully fix that little problem. Hopefully prevent him from having the kind of ending he had last year. They opted not to bring back goaltender coach Pierre Gros, and they replaced him with Stefan Waite, who was the goaltending coach for Corey Crawford and Ray Emery of the Chicago Blackhawks last year. He's now the goaltending coach for Carey Price and Peter Budaj of the Montreal Canadiens. And by the way, Peter Budaj was also signed to a 2-year contract extension this year. So he is back in Montreal. A good signing. I think he's a capable backup goaltender. So that probably is the biggest overall move this offseason, bringing in Stefan Waite from the Chicago Blackhawks, a big reason for their Cup championship. Hopefully he'll bring his success from Chicago to Montreal. But other than that, for Montreal, overall, pretty quiet offseason this year. They still have Jeff Halpern as an unrestricted free agent. It's still rather questionable whether they're going to sign him or not. I heard that at one point that they did want to. At the same time, I also heard that they were trying to also maybe get a guy like Darryl Powell from the New York Rangers. And we'll talk more about that later. But some of the guys that they did officially lose this season or are not bringing back, Colby Armstrong, a guy who grew up as a Montreal Canadiens fan, and a Quebec native. He is gone. He signed. He will not. He is gone, and he's actually gone from the NHL. He signs over in the KHL. Montreal was not going to bring him back. Thomas Cabriolet, he's still an unrestricted free agent. No, he is yet to be signed, but he is not returning to the Montreal Canadiens as he is no longer the same player and no longer in their plans. Defenseman Yannick Weber also gone, another guy who they opted not to bring back. He signs with the Vancouver Canucks. And then probably the guy who's considered the biggest loss, even though it was an intended one, Michael Ryder will not be back. They is gone once again. He signs over with the New Jersey Devils. So that was really the only issue, to replace him and also get a guy who has a lot of size. So they do go out and replace Michael Ryder, signing centerman / winger Danny Briere, coming over from the Philadelphia Flyers, signing a 2-year, $8 million contract. The Flyers used one of their compliance buyouts on Danny Briere to buy him out of the last couple years he had in Philly. He had a rough year last year, an injury-prone year for a team that did not make the playoffs. But now a guy who the Montreal Canadiens had wanted for a very long time and have had their eye on, a Montreal native, he is now a Montreal Canadien, Danny Briere. I think it's a good, I like the contract. I don't mind the contract. The player, however, is the real big question. This signing has been one of the more questioned signings in the NHL. He's a very skilled player when playing at his best, and even though he's not getting any younger, he still can play the game. He has a lot of skill, great first pass ability, and a good shot as well. A guy who is a game changer and a good leader in the locker room. However, the real big issue to this signing is the fact that he's a small guy. He's only 5'11", and that's really the issue with the Montreal Canadiens. This is the smallest team as far as size goes. They are the smallest team in the National Hockey League. They absolutely are. In fact, other than Jared Tenorti, not one player on their roster is bigger than 6'2", or Carey Price, for that matter, too. He's 6'3". But so other than Jared Tenorti and Carey Price, not one player on this roster is bigger than 6'2", which leads to our other acquisition. The Montreal Canadiens would go out and make a small trade this offseason, acquiring George Parros from the Florida Panthers in exchange for a draft pick. That was a loss for the Florida Panthers. I had forgotten to mention in the last video. They lose a physical player. But with the Montreal Canadiens, they gain a physical player and a popular player, too. He's always been one of the more popular players in the National Hockey League. The big mustache is probably the main reason why. But what's not to love about him either? He's 6'5", and it's a really underrated acquisition for the Montreal Canadiens, in my opinion. They had a guy with a lot of size, a lot of grit, guy who drops the gloves. He's a fighter and a grinder. He's not a scorer, but this is a guy who, if he does play, right now he's projected as the 13th forward, but if he does play, his physical abilities will open up some room for the smaller guys to do some work. So outside of George Parros, Jared Tenorti, who is probably expected to play in the NHL this year, and Carey Price, there's nobody on this roster that's bigger than 6'2". This is the smallest team in the National Hockey League as far as size goes. They absolutely are. They are absolutely the smallest team in the National Hockey League, and they've been that way for a couple of years. They had Scott Gomez for a couple of years. He's a small guy. They had Mike Camilleri for a little while. He's a small guy. And as far as who they still have, they now have Danny Briere. He's a small guy. Thomas Plekanec, he's a small guy. David Desharnais, he's a really small guy. Brendan Gallagher, he's a small guy. Brian Giunta, really small guy. And then on defense, Rafael Diaz, he's a small guy. And Francis Bouillon, he's a small guy. So 7 players on this roster, 5'11" or smaller. It is not good, and that is why the signing of Danny Briere does go in question. It adds another small guy to a really small team, and they can't have that. They need those size guys, which is why I like the George Peros acquisition a lot, and it really goes underrated, in my opinion. But honestly, I think the Briere signing will be fine. Again, it's not that bad of a contract, luckily. So, um, and they even have some prospects too that are pretty small too. Guys like Sebastian Kohlberg, he's a smaller guy. Michael Bourneval, he's a smaller guy. Charles Hudden, he's a smaller guy. They also made another minor trade this offseason, but one that I think could prove to be bigger than it looks now. They acquired Christian Thomas from the New York Rangers in exchange for Danny Cristo. Christian Thomas, a guy who was once a top prospect for the New York Rangers. He was once their second most sought-after prospect, but unfortunately now not in the top 10 for Montreal. But he's a guy who I think does have a bright future in the National Hockey League, son of Steve Thomas. Very skilled player, but again, another small player there. He's 5'8", um, and Danny Cristo a bit bigger than that. So I think again they get a skilled guy, a guy with a good shot. The only issue is his size. So, but other than that, I think he's going to be a good player at some point. So that goes down to me as another underrated trade both ways, and I'll talk a lot more about that trade when we talk about the New York Rangers. But anyway, the big questions for this team, though, now with these acquisitions and signings and re-signings, the big question for this team is, because they're so small, is their size going to be enough for them to get back in the playoffs? That's really the big question here. I'm not so sure. Personally, I would personally assume that they would be back in the playoffs, but we will see. Again, it's a really small team, and it's fine to have during the regular season, but during the playoffs, you need those bigger guys. And that really became a big issue last year in that 5-game loss to the Ottawa Senators. Ottawa had a lot of size on their side. Montreal did not. And not to mention, again, Carey Price. He's a good goalie, but at times he can be very inconsistent. And that was the case at the end of the year this past year. So he needs to be better. And those are really the biggest questions for Montreal. Also, can PK Subban have a repeat season? Can guys like Alex Galchenyuk, Brendan Gallagher, can they take it to another level this year, or will they go through the sophomore slump? Will the signing of Danny Briere be worth it? Um, is a guy like Jared Tenorti ready to step into the National Hockey League this year? He definitely is capable. He played at the end of the year last year and throughout the playoffs. He is 6'6", so he's their biggest guy right now. Basically, their replacement for Hal Gill, who was the biggest player they had for a while up until now. So, yeah, I mean, another guy who could definitely compete this year, Nathan Beaulieu. But he'll definitely at least play for Hamilton in the American Hockey League, the Hamilton Bulldogs. So honestly, I think they're pretty much set as far as their roster goes. Plekanec, Briere, Galchenyuk, Desharnais, Gallagher, Pacioretty, Eller, Giunta, their captain, Rennie Bork, Mullen, White, Ryan White, Brandon Brust, George Peros, and then on defense, Andrei Markov, PK Subban, Josh Georges, Jared Tenorti, Alexei Emelin, Rafael Diaz, Francis Bouillon, Davis Jawiski, and then in goal, Carey Price and Peter Budaj. And speaking of which, a couple of other questions too regarding their defense. Speaking of their defense, can Andrei Markov get himself back into form after a couple of injury-prone years? And how well is this defense going to do is this defense going to do without Alexei Emelin? Alexei Emelin, a shutdown defenseman, Russian-born defenseman. He's actually become one of the more valuable defensemen on this team in the short time he's played. However, he will not be playing a game this season until late November. They're going to be without him for the beginning of the year, and unfortunately, they do not have a lot of depth on their defense, which means a guy like Nathan Beaulieu could step in, or maybe, they also got Francis Bouillon and Davis Drewiski as their 7th and 8th guys. So that'll be interesting to see. Outside of Markov, Subban, and Georges, and Emelin, they don't have a lot of depth on defense. Tenorti, Diaz, they're young guys. So that's really the biggest question for Montreal. How's their defense going to hold up without Alexei Emelin at the beginning of the season? All right, guys, let's take a look now at the Montreal Canadiens' top prospects. Honestly, based off what I've seen, I think they have a good prospect pool. However, it's probably the least impressive of the new Atlantic Division so far. Not as good as the Boston Bruins, Buffalo Sabres, Detroit Red Wings, or Florida Panthers. So far, it is the weakest of the prospect pool, but it's not saying a lot because they do have a solid one. It's the fact that a lot of their top prospects, like Alex Galchenyuk and Brendan Gallagher, those guys are now in the NHL. So Lars Eller, PK Subban, Max Pacioretty, those guys are all in the NHL now. Nathan Beaulieu is their top prospect right now. Jared Tenorti is their second. Sebastian Kohlberg is in there. Mike McCarron, their first-round pick from this past year, big forward. Jacob De La Rose, second-round pick from this year. Tim Bozon's on there. So they have a lot of good prospects. However, the one prospect that catches my eye more than anybody, and I think I have good reasoning for this one, is their number 4 prospect, goaltender, Zachary Fucale, the first goaltender that I have picked as my top prospect. The second-round pick, Montreal's second-round pick from this past year, 36th overall. Very, very skilled goaltender. Was a superstar for the Halifax Mooseheads of the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League this past year. One of the very reasons why they won the Memorial Cup this past year against the Portland Winterhawks of the Western Hockey League. Was the best goaltender in the Canadian Hockey League. 45 wins, a stellar goals against average, and a stellar save percentage. This is a guy who competes at every level, and no matter how many goals he gives up, he fights to stay in the game. He doesn't get pulled much, and he fights to win. He's a winner at every level, and I think the Montreal Canadiens have a very good situation in goal with Carey Price and Peter Budaj and Zach Fucale waiting in the wings in case one of those guys doesn't perform well or gets traded at some point. Who knows? If Carey Price disappoints, they'll have Fucale waiting, ready and waiting. I think it's a great situation to be in, similar to the Anaheim Ducks with John Gibson, Jonas Hiller, and Victor Fost. All right, now, the player on this Montreal Canadiens team that I think needs to perform well this season for the Canadiens to get back into the playoffs, no question whatsoever, has to be Andrei Markov. Andrei Markov had a very good year last year. He was finally healthy for a full year, and he played solid, 10 goals, 30 points. Again, maybe not his usual numbers that we used to see, but solid enough. He looked like the old Andrei Markov up until the playoffs. And so he needs to be that player again, and he needs to go back to playing at the old level. If he can do that, the Canadiens are going to be fine. Overall, is this team a playoff team? It's very questionable with their size, but honestly, I think I'm going to say yes. I don't think they're going to be as good as they were last year. I think they will have some struggles, but I do still think at the end of the day, this team is a playoff team. I like Carey Price in goal, and I like their forward core a lot. I think that they're good enough for a good regular season run, a late regular season run to the playoffs. So I think the Montreal Canadiens are a playoff team. All right, guys, that'll do for episode 21 of Hockey on the Spot. Join me again tomorrow when I talk about the Ottawa Senators. So until then, this has been Hockey on the Spot with Brandon Barenfeld. I'm Brandon Barenfeld. See you guys tomorrow. Thank you very much, and have a great day.